At least one person is dead after a masked man armed with a sword attacked a school in western Sweden, according to reports. 400 students
fact-centric investigation in such a, quote, political environment. I have great respect for the chairman, but on this score, he is absolutely wrong. In fact, it has been done by his own Republican colleagues in the House on this very issue, Benghazi. The Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee conducted an extensive, bipartisan, 2-year investigation and issued a detailed report. The Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee also conducted a bipartisan investigation. Those bipartisan efforts respected and honored the memories of the 4 brave Americans who gave their lives in Benghazi. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty. The problem is that the Republican caucus did not like the answers they got from those investigations. So they set up this select committee with no rules, no deadline, and an unlimited budget. And they set them loose, Madam Secretary, because you're running for president. Clearly, it is possible to conduct a serious bipartisan investigation. What is impossible is for any reasonable person to continue denying that Republicans are squandering millions of taxpayer dollars on this abusive effort to derail Secretary Clinton's presidential campaign. In the chairman's interview, he tried to defend against this criticism by attempting to cast himself as the victim. And he complained about attacks on the credibility of the Select Committee. His argument would be more compelling if Republicans weren't leading the charge. As we all know, Representative Kevin McCarthy, Speaker Boehner's second-in-command and the chairman's close friend, admitted that they established the Select Committee to drive down Secretary Clinton's poll numbers. Democrats didn't say that. The second-in-command in the House said that, a Republican. Republican Congressman Richard Hanna said the Select Committee was, quote, designed to go after Secretary Clinton. And one of the chairman's own hand-picked investigators, a self-proclaimed conservative Republican, charged that he was fired in part for not going along with these plans to, quote, hyper-focus on Hillary Clinton, end of quote. These stark admissions reflect exactly what we have seen inside the Select Committee for the past year. Let's just take a look at the facts. Since January, Republicans have canceled every single hearing on our schedule for the entire year, except for this one, Secretary Clinton. They also canceled numerous interviews that they had planned with the Defense Department and the CIA officials. Instead of doing that, they said what they were going to do. Republicans zeroed in on Secretary Clinton, her speechwriters, her IT staffers, and her campaign officials. This is what the Republicans did, not the Democrats. When Speaker Boehner established this Select Committee, he justified it by arguing that it would, quote, cross jurisdictional lines. I assume he meant we would focus on more than just Secretary of State. But Madam Secretary, you're sitting there by yourself. Secretary of Defense is not on your left. Director of the CIA is not on your right. That's because Republicans abandoned their own plans to question those top officials. So instead of being cross-jurisdictional, Republicans just crossed them off the list. Last weekend, the chairman told the Republican colleagues to shut up, stop talking about the Select Committee. want to know is this, and this is a key question. Why tell the Republicans to shut up when they are telling the truth, but not when they are attacking Secretary Clinton with reckless accusations that are demonstrably false? Why not tell them to shut up then? Carly Fiorina has said that Secretary Clinton has blood on her hands. Mike Huckabee accused her of ignoring the warning calls from dying Americans in Benghazi. Senator Rand Paul said Benghazi was a 3 a.m. phone call that she never picked up. And Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, "Where the hell were you on the night of the Benghazi attack?" Everyone on this panel knows these accusations are baseless, from our own investigation and all those before it. Yet, Republican members of this select committee remain silent. On Monday, the Democrats issued a report showing that none of the 54 witnesses the committee interviewed substantiated these wild Republican claims. Secretary Clinton did not order the military to stand down, and she neither approved nor denied requests for additional security. I ask that our report be included in the official record for this hearing. Chairman. What is so telling is that we issued virtually the same report a year ago. Same report. When we first joined the Select Committee, I asked my staff to put together a complete report and database setting forth the questions that have been asked about the attacks and all of the answers that were provided in the 8 previous investigations. I asked that this report also be included in the record, Mr. Chairman. The problem is that rather than accepting these facts, Republicans continue to spin new conspiracy theories that are just as outlandish and inaccurate. For example, the chairman recently tried to argue that Sidney Blumenthal was Secretary Clinton's primary advisor on Libya. And this past Sunday, Representative Pompeo claimed on national television that Secretary Clinton relied on Sidney Blumenthal for most of her intelligence on Libya. Earlier this week, the Washington Post fact checker awarded this claim 4 Pinocchios, its worst rating. Here's the bottom line. The Select Committee has spent 17 months and $4.7 million of taxpayer money. We've held 4 hearings and conducted 54 interviews and depositions. Yes, we have received some new emails from Secretary Clinton, Ambassador Stevens, and others. And yes, we have conducted some new interviews. But these documents and interviews do not show any nefarious activity. In fact, it's just the opposite. The new information we have obtained confirms and corroborates the core facts we already knew from 8 previous investigations. They provide more detail, but they do not change the basic conclusions. It is time now for the Republicans to end this taxpayer-funded fishing expedition. We need to come together and shift from politics to policy. That's what the American people want, shifting from politics to policy. We need to finally make good on our promises to the families. And the families only asked us to do 3 things. 1, do not make this a political football. 2, find the facts. 3, do everything in your power to make sure that this does not happen again. So we need to start focusing on what we here in Congress can do to improve the safety and security of our diplomatic corps in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentleman from Maryland. Madam Secretary, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of this committee. terrorist attacks at our diplomatic compound and later at the CIA post in Benghazi, Libya on September 11th, 2012, took the lives of 4 brave Americans: Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods. I'm here to honor the service of those 4 men. The courage of the Diplomatic Security Agency and the CIA officers who risked their lives that night, and the work their colleagues do every single day all over the world. I knew and admired Chris Stevens. He was one of our nation's most accomplished diplomats. Chris's mother liked to say that he had sand in his shoes because he was always moving, always working, especially in the Middle East, that he came to know so well. When the revolution broke out in Libya, we named Chris as our envoy to the opposition. There was no easy way to get him into Benghazi to begin gathering information and meeting those Libyans who were rising up against the murderous dictator Gaddafi. But he found a way to get himself there on a Greek cargo ship, just like a 19th century American envoy. But his work was very much 21st century hard-nosed diplomacy. It is a testament to the relationships that he built in Libya that on the day following the awareness of his death, tens of thousands of Libyans poured into the streets in Benghazi. They held signs reading, "Thugs don't represent Benghazi or Islam. Sorry, people of America, this is not the behavior of our Islam or our prophet." Chris Stevens, a friend to all Libyans. Although I didn't have the privilege of meeting Sean Smith personally, he was a valued member of our State Department family. Air Force veteran, he was an information management officer who had served in Pretoria, Baghdad, Montreal, and The Hague. Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty worked for the CIA. They were killed by mortar fire at the CIA's outpost in Benghazi, a short distance from the diplomatic compound. They were both former Navy SEALs and trained paramedics with distinguished records of service, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. As Secretary of State, I had the honor to lead and the responsibility to support nearly 70,000 diplomats and development experts across the globe. Losing any one of them, as we did in Iraq, Afghanistan, Mexico, Haiti, and Libya, during my tenure was deeply painful for our entire State Department and USAID family, and for me personally. I was the one who asked Chris to go to Libya as our envoy. I was the one who recommended him to be our ambassador to the president. After the attacks, I stood next to President Obama as Marines carried his casket and those of the other 3 Americans off the plane at Andrews Air Force Base. I took responsibility. And as part of that, before I left office, I launched reforms to better protect our people in the field and help reduce the chance of another tragedy happening in the future. What happened in Benghazi has been scrutinized by a nonpartisan, hard-hitting accountability review board, 7 prior congressional investigations, multiple news organizations, and of course, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So today, I would like to share 3 observations about how we can learn from this tragedy and move forward as a nation. First, America must lead in a dangerous world, and our diplomats must continue representing us in dangerous places. The State Department sends people to more than 270 posts in 170 countries around the world. Chris Stevens understood that diplomats must operate in many places where our soldiers do not, where there are no other boots on the ground, and safety is far from guaranteed. In fact, he volunteered for just those assignments. He also understood we will never prevent every act of terrorism or achieve perfect security, and that we inevitably must accept a level of risk to protect our country and advance our interests and values. And make no mistake, risks are real. Terrorists have killed more than 65 American diplomatic personnel since the 1970s, and more than 100 contractors and locally employed staff. Since 2001, there have been more than 100 attacks on U.S. diplomatic facilities. If you ask our most experienced ambassadors, they'll tell you they can't do their jobs for us. It would compound the tragedy of Benghazi if Chris Stevens' death and the death of the other 3 Americans ended up undermining the work which he and they devoted their lives. We have learned the hard way, when America is absent, especially from unstable places, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, aggressors seek to fill the vacuum, and security everywhere is threatened, including here at home. That's why Chris was in Benghazi. It's why he had served previously in Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jerusalem during the Second Intifada. Nobody knew the dangers of Libya better. Weak government, extremist groups, rampant instability. Chris chose to go to Benghazi because he understood America had to be represented there at that pivotal time. He knew that eastern Libya was where the revolution had begun, and that unrest there could derail the country's fragile transition to democracy. And if extremists gained a foothold, they would have the chance to destabilize the entire region, including Egypt and Tunisia. He also knew how urgent it was to ensure that the weapons Gaddafi had left strewn across the country, including shoulder-fired missiles that could knock an airplane out of the sky, did not fall into the wrong hands. The nearest Israeli airport is just a day's drive from the Libyan border. Above all, Chris understood that most people in Libya or anywhere reject the extremists' argument that violence can ever be a path to dignity or justice. That's what those thousands of Libyans were saying after they learned of his death. And he understood there was no substitute. Going beyond the mental walls and doing hard work on relationships. Retreat from the world is not an option. America cannot shrink from our responsibility to lead. That doesn't mean we should ever return to the go-it-alone foreign policy of the past, a foreign policy that puts boots on the ground as a first choice rather than a last choice. Quite the opposite. We need creative, confident leadership that harnesses all of America's strengths and values. Leadership that integrates and balances the tools of diplomacy, development, and defense. And at the heart of that effort must be dedicated professionals like Chris Stevens and his colleagues, who put their lives on the line for a country, our country, because they believe, as I do, that America is the greatest force for peace and progress the world has ever known. My second observation is this: we have a responsibility to provide our diplomats with the resources and support they need to do their jobs as safely and effectively as possible. After previous deadly attacks, leaders from both parties and both branches of government came together, determined what went wrong and how to fix it for the future. That's what happened during the Reagan administration. Attacked our embassy, killed 63 people, including 17 Americans. And then in a later attacked the barracks, killed so many more. The two attacks in Beirut resulted in the deaths of 258 Americans. It's what happened during the Clinton administration when Al-Qaeda bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing more than 200 people, wounding more than 2,000 people, and killing 12 Americans. Part of America's strength to learn, we adapt, and get stronger. After the Benghazi attacks, I asked Ambassador to one of our most distinguished and longest-serving diplomats, along with Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff appointed by President George W. Bush, to lead an accountability review board. This is an institution that the Congress set up after the terrible attacks in Beirut. There have been 18 previous leaders who have ever made their findings public. One following the attacks in embassies in West Africa, and the one following the Accountability Review Board did not hold a single found systemic management deficiencies in 2 State Department reports. The review board recommended 29 specific improvements. I pledged that by the time I left office, everyone would be on the More Marines slated for deployment to high-threat embassies. Additional diplomatic security agents were being hired and trained. And Secretary Kerry has continued this work. But there is more to do, and no administration can do it alone. Congress has to be our partner, as it has been after previous tragedies. For example, the Accountability Review Board and subsequent investigations have recommended improved training for our officers before they deploy to the field. But efforts to establish a modern joint training center are being held up by Congress. Men and women who serve our country deserve. Finally, there is one more observation I'd like to share. I traveled to 112 countries as Secretary of State. Every time I did, I felt great pride and honor representing the country that I love. We need leadership at home to match our leadership abroad. Leadership that puts national security ahead of politics and ideology. Our nation has a long history of bipartisan cooperation on foreign policy and national security. Not that we always agree, far from it. But we do come together when it counts. Secretary of State, I worked with the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to pass a landmark nuclear arms control treaty with Russia. I worked with the Republican leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, to open up Burma, now Myanmar, to democratic change. I know it's possible to find common ground because I have done it. We should debate on the basis of fact, not fear. We should resist denigrating the patriotism or loyalty of those with whom we disagree. So I'm here. Despite all the previous investigations and all the talk about partisan agendas, I'm here to honor those we lost and to do what I can to aid those who serve us still. My challenge to you, members of this committee, is the same challenge I put to myself. Let's be worthy of the trust the American people have bestowed upon us. They expect us to lead, to learn the right lessons, to rise above partisanship, and to reach for statesmanship. That's what I try to do every day as Secretary of State, and it's what I hope we will all strive for here today and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I did not cut off your opening at all, nor would I think about doing so, because the subject matter is critically important and you deserve to be heard. I would just simply note that, and I don't plan on cutting off any of your answers. Our members have questions that we believe are worthy of being answered, so I would just simply note that we do plan to ask all of the questions, and whatever precision and concision that you can give to the answers without giving short shrift to any of the answers would be much appreciated. And with that, I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscoe.
Morning, Secretary Clinton. Jake Sullivan, your chief foreign policy advisor, wrote a TikTok on Libya memo on August 21st, 2011, and this was the day before the rebels took Tripoli. He titles it, quote, Secretary Clinton's leadership on Libya, in which he describes you as, quote, a critical voice and, quote, the public face of the U.S. effort in Libya, and instrumental in tightening the noose around Gaddafi and his regime. But that didn't come easy, did it? Because you faced considerable opposition, and I can pause while you're reading your notes from your statement.
One thing at a time, Congressman. Thanks.
That didn't come easy, did it? That leadership role and that public face and so forth that I just mentioned?
No, this is an issue that the committee has raised, and it really boils down to why were we in Libya? Why did the United States join with our NATO and European allies, join with our Arab partners to protect the people of Libya against the murderous planning of Gaddafi? Why did we take a role alongside our partners in doing so? There were a number of reasons for that, and I think it is important to remind the American people where we were at the time when the people of Libya, like people across the region, rose up demanding freedom and democracy, a chance to chart their own futures. And Gaddafi threatened them with genocide, with hunting them down like cockroaches. And we were then approached by, with great intensity, our closest allies in Europe. People who felt very strongly, the French and the British, but others as well, that they could not stand idly by and permit that to happen so close to their shores with the unintended consequences that they worried about. And they asked for the United States to help. We did not immediately say yes. We did an enormous amount of due diligence in meeting with not only our European and Arab partners, but also with those who were heading up what was called the Transitional National Council. And we had experienced diplomats who were digging deep into what was happening in Libya and what the possibilities were before we agreed to provide very specific, limited help to the European and Arab efforts. We did not put one American soldier on the ground. We did not have one casualty. And in fact, I think by many measures, The cooperation between NATO and Arab forces was quite remarkable and something that we want to learn more lessons from.
Secretary Clinton, you were meeting with opposition within the State Department, from very senior career diplomats, in fact, and they were saying that it was going to produce a net negative for U.S. military intervention. For example, in a March 9th, 2011 email discussing what has become known as the Libya Options Memo, Ambassador Stephen Mull, then the Executive Secretary of the State Department, and one of the top career diplomats, said this: "In the case of our diplomatic history, when we've provided material or tactical military support to people seeking to drive their leaders from power, no matter how just their cause, it's tended to produce net negatives for our interests over the long term in those countries." Now, we'll come back to that in a minute, but you overruled those career diplomats. I mean, they report to you, and you're the chief diplomat of the United States. Go ahead and read the note if you need to.
I have to.
I'm not done with my question. I'm just giving you the courtesy of reading your notes.
That's all right.
All right. They were pushing back, but you overcame those objections. But then you had another big obstacle, didn't you? And that was the White House itself. There were senior voices within the White House that were opposed to military action. Vice President Biden, Department of Defense, Secretary Gates, the National Security Council, and so forth. But you persuaded President Obama to intervene militarily. Isn't that right?
Well, Congressman, I think it's important to point out there were many in the State Department who believed it was very much in America's interests and in furtherance of our values to protect the Libyan people, to join with our European allies and our Arab partners. The ambassador, who had to be withdrawn from Libya because of direct attack or direct threats to his physical safety, but who knew Libya very well, Ambassador Kretz, was a strong advocate for doing what we could to assist the Europeans and the Arabs. I think it's fair to say there were concerns and there were varying opinions about what to do, how to do it, and the like. At the end of the day, this was the president's decision, and all of us fed in our views. I did not favor it until I had done, as I said, the due diligence, speaking with not just people within our government and within the governments of all of the other nations who were urging us to assist them, but also meeting in person with the gentleman who had assumed a lead role in the Transitional National Council. So it is, of course, fair to say this was a difficult decision. I wouldn't sit here and say otherwise, and there were varying points of view about it. But at the end of the day, in large measure, because of the strong appeals from our European allies, the Arab League passing a resolution urging that the United States and NATO join with them, those were unprecedented requests. And we did decide, in recommending to the president, that there was a way to do it. The president, I think, very clearly had a limited instruction about how to proceed. And the first planes that flew were French planes. And I think what the United States provided was some of our unique capacity. But the bulk of the work militarily was done by Europeans and Arabs.
Well, I think you're underselling yourself. You got the State Department on board, you convinced the president, you overcame the objections of Vice President Biden and Secretary of Defense Gates, the National Security Council, and you had another obstacle then, and that was the United Nations. And you were able to persuade the Russians, of all things, to abstain, and had you not been successful in arguing that abstention, the Security Council Resolution 1973 wouldn't have passed because the Russians had a veto. So you overcame that obstacle as well. Isn't that right?
Well, Congressman, it is right that after doing my due diligence and reviewing the various options and the potential consequences of pursuing each of them, I was in favor of the United States joining with our European allies and our Arab partners, and I also was in favor of obtaining UN Security Council support because I thought that would provide greater legitimacy. In that, of course, our ambassador to the UN was very influential and successful in making the case to her colleagues. But this was at the behest of and the direction of the president once he was presented with the varying arguments.
And you presented
Congressman,
the argument.
I have been in a number of Situation Room discussions. I remember very well the very intense conversation over whether or not to launch the Navy SEALs against the compound we thought in Abbottabad that might house bin Laden. There was a split in the advisors around the president. Eventually, the president makes the decision. I supported doing what we could to support our European and Arab partners in their effort on a humanitarian basis, a strategic basis to prevent Gaddafi from launching and carrying out mass massacres.
There was another obstacle that you overcame, and that was the Arabs themselves. Jake Sullivan sent you an email, and he said this: I think you should call. It will be painful 10 minutes, but you will be the one who delivered Arab support. And that's a Jake Sullivan email of March 17th to you, asking you to call the Secretary General of the Arab League. So to put this in totality, you were able to overcome opposition within the State Department. You were able to persuade the president. You were able to persuade the United Nations and the international community. You made the call to the Arabs and brought them home. You saw it, you drove it, you articulated it, and you persuaded people. Did I get that wrong?
Well, Congressman, I was the Secretary of State. My job was to conduct the diplomacy, and the diplomacy consisted of a long series of meetings and phone calls, both here in our country and abroad, to take the measure of what people were saying and whether they meant it. We had heard sometimes before from countries saying, well, the United States should go do this. And when we'd say, well, what will you do in support of us? There was not much coming forth. This time, if they wanted us to support them in what they saw as an action vital to their respective national security interests, I wanted to be sure that they were going to bear the bulk of the load, and in fact they did. What the United States did, as I've said, was use our unique capacities. As I recall, if you want it in monetary terms, slightly over $1 billion or less than what we spend in Iraq in one day is what the United States committed in support of our allies. You know, we ask our allies to do a lot for us, Congressman.
Let me reclaim
They
my
had
time.
asked for us to help them.
Let me reclaim my time because it's expiring. Actually, you summed it up best when you emailed your senior staff and you said of this interchange, you said it's good to remind ourselves and the rest of the world that this couldn't have happened without us. And you were right, Secretary Clinton. Our Libya policy couldn't have happened without you because you were its chief architect. And I said we're going to go back to Ambassador Mull's warning about using military for regime change, and he said long-term things weren't going to turn out very well, and he was right. After your plan, things in Libya today are a disaster. I yield back.
Well, we'll have more time, I'm sure, to talk about this because that's not a view that I will ascribe to.
Thank the gentleman from Illinois and recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Again, I want to thank you for being here. I want to start with the number one question that Republicans claim has not been answered in 8 previous investigations. Yesterday, the chairman wrote an op-ed, and he said this is his top unanswered question about Benghazi, and it is, and I quote, why our people in Libya and Benghazi made so many requests for additional security personnel and equipment, and why those requests were denied. I'll give you a chance to answer in a minute. Secretary Clinton, as you know, this exact question has been asked many times and answered many times. Let's start with the Accountability Review Board. Now, you a moment ago, you talked about Admiral Mullen, but you also appointed another very distinguished gentleman, Ambassador Pickering. And of course, Admiral Mullen served under Republican administrations, and Ambassador Pickering, who I have a phenomenal amount of respect for, served 40 years, as you know, as a part of our diplomatic corps. He served under George H.W. Bush, and he also served as UN ambassador he also served under Reagan. Now, I'm just wondering, let me go back to that question. Why our people in Libya and Benghazi made so many requests? And then I want you to comment, it seems to be an implication that the ARB, Accountability Review Board, was not independent. And I think the chairman said they were handpicked by you. Of course, that's done by law. But would you comment on those two things, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. As I said in my opening statement, I take responsibility for what happened in Benghazi. I felt a responsibility for all 70,000 people working at the State Department and USAID. I take that very seriously. As I said with respect to security requests in Benghazi back when I testified in January of 2013, those requests and issues related to security were rightly handled by the security professionals in the department. I did not see them, I did not approve them, I did not deny them. Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen make this case very clearly in their testimony before your committee and in their public comments. These issues would not ordinarily come before the Secretary of State, and they did not in this case. As Secretary, I was committed to taking aggressive measures to ensure our personnel's and facilities were as safe as possible. And certainly when the nonpartisan, critical report from the Accountability Review Board came forward, I took it very seriously, and that's why I embraced all of their recommendations and created a new position within the Diplomatic Security Bureau specifically to evaluate high-risk posts. I think it's important also to mention, Congressman, that the diplomatic security professionals who are reviewing these requests, along with those who are serving in war zones and hotspots around the world, have great expertise and experience in keeping people safe. If you go on CODELs, they are the ones who plan your trip to keep you safe. They certainly did that for me, but most importantly, that's what they do every day for everybody who serves our country as a diplomat or development professional. And I was not going to second guess them. I was not going to substitute my judgment, which is not based on experience that they have in keeping people safe for theirs. And the changes that were recommended by the Accountability Review Board are ones that we thought made sense and began quickly to implement.
Now, the ARB, after conducting, Madam Secretary, more than 100 interviews, identified specific employee and a specific employee at the State Department who denied these requests. It was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, Charlene Lamb, and again, she did come before the Oversight Committee. The ARB report was very critical of her. It was also critical of her two supervisors, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and the Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security. The Oversight Committee found the same answer as the ARB. It found that this official denied these requests, and it found no evidence that you approved or denied them. The problem is that Republicans just keep asking the same question over and over again and pretend they don't know the answer. In 2013, the Republican chairman of 5 House committees issued a report falsely accusing you personally of denying these requests in a cable over your signature. The next day, the chairman of the Oversight Committee, Darrell Issa, went on national television and accused you of the same thing. Can you play that clip, please?
Secretary of State was just wrong. She said she did not participate in this, and yet only a few months before the attack, she outright denied security in her signature in a cable, April 2012.
Do you remember that allegation, Madam Secretary?
I do.
Well, when the Washington Post fact checker examined this claim, they gave it 4 Pinocchios. They called it a whopper. It turns out that the Republicans had a copy of that cable, but they didn't tell the American people that your so-called signature was just a stamp that appeared on millions of cables from the State Department every single year. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, Madam Secretary, my goal has always been to gather facts and to defend the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Last year I asked our staff to compile an asked and answered database, and this specific issue was answered thoroughly. On Monday we put out another report, and this issue was addressed yet again. But the Republicans want to keep this attack going, so they are now trying to argue that we have new emails that raise new questions. The truth is that we have reviewed these emails, and they don't contradict the previous conclusions. They confirm them. They corroborate them. We've reviewed emails from Ambassador Stevens, and they show that he asked Charlene Lamb for more security. Nothing we have obtained, not the new interviews or the new emails, changes the basic facts we have known for 3 years. Secretary Clinton, let me ask one final question, and please take as much time as you want to answer this. There's no evidence to support the Republican claims that you personally rejected security requests. So some have argued that you, since you knew the danger was increasing in Libya, you should have been in there making detailed decisions about whether there should be 5, 7, or even 9 security officers at any given post. Madam Secretary, I know you have answered over again. You might want to just elaborate and just give you have 1 minute and 7 seconds.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think there has been some confusion, and I welcome the opportunity to try to clarify it to the best of my ability. With respect, as you rightly point out, the claims that were made about the cables, I think you have explained the fact, which is that it's the long-standing tradition of the State Department for cables from around the world to be sent to and sent from the State Department under the signature, over the signature of the Secretary of State. It's a stamp. It's just part of the tradition. There are millions of them, as you point out. They are sorted through and directed to the appropriate personnel. Very few of them ever come to my attention. None of them with respect to security regarding Benghazi did. Then the other point, which I thank you for raising so that perhaps I can speak to this one as well. There is, of course, information that we were obtaining about the increasingly dangerous environment in Libya, across the country, but in particular in eastern Libya. And we were aware of that, and we were certainly taking that into account. There was no actionable intelligence on September 11th, or even before that date, about any kind of planned attack on our compound in Benghazi. And there were a lot of debates, apparently, that went on within the security professionals about what to provide, because they did have to prioritize. The Accountability Review Board pointed that out. The State Department has historically, and certainly before this terrible incident, not had the amount of money that we thought would be necessary to do what was required to protect everyone. So of course there had to be priorities, and that was something that the security professionals dealt with. I think that both Admiral Mullen and Ambassador Pickering made it very clear that they thought that the high threat post should move to a higher level of scrutiny, and we had immediately moved to do that.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The chair would now recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks.
Good morning, Secretary Clinton. Good morning.
Thank you for being here today. In drawing on what you just said, that very few, but no requests for Benghazi came to your attention. I'd like to show you something. This pile represents the emails that you sent or received about Libya in 2011, from February through December of 2011. This pile represents the emails you sent or received from early 2012 until the day of the attack. There are 795 emails in this pile. We've counted them. There are 67 emails in this pile in 2012. And I'm troubled by what I see here. And so my questions relate to these piles. In this pile in 2011, I see daily updates, sometimes hourly updates, from your staff about Benghazi and Chris Stevens. When I look at this pile, in 2012, I only see a handful of emails to you from your senior staff about Benghazi, and I have several questions for you about this disparity, because we know from talking to your senior advisors, they knew, and many of them are here today, seated behind you, they knew to send you important information, issues that were of importance to you, and I can only conclude by your own records that there was a lack of interest in Libya in 2012. So let's first focus, though, on this pile and what was happening in Libya in 2011. We had an ambassador to Libya, Ambassador Kretz, but you've told us that, and you told us in your opening, you handpicked Chris Stevens to be your special representative in Benghazi, and you sent him here. And by your own emails, most have provided last February, a few provided just a few weeks ago, they show that in March of 11, so we're in March of 11, you had Chris Stevens join you in Paris, where you were meeting with the leader of the Libyan revolution. And after Paris, that is when, as you talked about, Chris Stevens went into Benghazi, I believe in April 5th of 2011, on that Greek cargo ship. How long was he expected to stay? What were Chris Stevens' orders from you about Libya and about Benghazi specifically?
Chris Stevens was asked to go to Benghazi to do reconnaissance, to try to figure out who were the leaders of the insurgency who were based in Benghazi, what their goals were, what they understood would happen if they were successful. It was, as I said, the hard-nosed 21st century diplomacy that is rooted in the old-fashioned necessary work of building relationships and gathering information.
How long was he anticipated to stay in Benghazi? Do you recall?
It was open-ended. We were, in discussing it with him, unsure as to how productive it would be, whether it would be appropriate for him to stay for a long time or a short time. That was very much going to depend upon Chris's own assessment. We knew we were sending someone who understood the area, who understood the language, who understood a lot of the personalities because of the historical study that he used to love to do, and we were going to be guided by what he decided.
I'd like to draw your attention to an email. It's an email found in tab 1. It's an Ops Center email that was forwarded to you from Huma Abedin on Sunday, March 27th. That says at the bottom of the email, so the current game plan is for Mr. Stevens to move no later Wednesday from Malta to Benghazi, but the bottom of the email says the goal of this one-day trip is for him to lay the groundwork for a stay of up to 30 days. So just to refresh that recollection, I believe initially the goal was to go in for 30 days. Were you personally briefed on his security plan prior to him going into Libya? Because at that time, if I'm not mistaken, I'm sorry to interrupt, Gaddafi's forces were still battling the rebels, correct?
That's right.
And so what were you personally briefed before you sent Mr. Stevens into Benghazi?
I was personally told by the officials who were in the State Department who were immediately above Chris, who were making the plans for him to go in, that it was going to be expeditionary diplomacy. It was going to require him to make a lot of judgments on the ground about what he could accomplish, and including where it would be safe for him to be and how long for him to stay. And I think the initial decision was, up to 30 days and reassess, but it could have been 10 days, it could have been 60 days, depending upon what he found and what he reported back to us.
And possibly what was determined about the danger of Benghazi. Who were those officials? Secretary?
Well, there were a number of officials who were working.
That were advising you on the security specifically.
Well, with respect to the security, this was a particular concern of the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau in which Chris worked.
I'm sorry, what was that person's name?
Assistant Secretary Jeff Feldman.
Thank you.
And it was also a concern of the Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security, as well as other officials within the State Department. And I think it's fair to say, Congresswoman, this was, we all knew, a risky undertaking. And it was something that was, as I said in my opening statement, more reminiscent of the way diplomacy was practiced back in the 19th century, because we didn't have the internet. We didn't have instantaneous communications. You would send diplomats and envoys into places and not hear from them for maybe months. This was obviously not of that kind, but it was not that different in degree from what we had done before, and it was a risky undertaking, and one which Chris volunteered for and was anxious to undertake.
And it was so risky, I'd like to pull up another email from the Ops Center that was forwarded to you from Ms. Abedin on Sunday, April 10th. So he had been there about 5 days, and it indicates that the situation in Ajdabiya had worsened to the point where Stevens is considering departing from Benghazi. This is within 5 days of him going in. Were you aware of that concern within the first 5 days that he had gone in?
Yeah.
And did anyone share that with you? And
yes,
who did share that with you?
We were aware because we were really counting on Chris to guide us and give us the information from the ground. We had no other sources. There was no American outpost. There was no, American military presence. Eventually, other Americans representing different agencies were able to get into Benghazi and begin to do the same work, but they, of course, couldn't do that work overtly, which is why we wanted a diplomat who could be publicly meeting with people to try to get the best assessment. But it was always going to be a constant risk, and we knew that.
And so let me go back to the risk in 2011, because there was a lot of communication, once again, from your senior staff, from the State Department, to you or from you in 2011. And in fact, that is when Gaddafi fell. He fell in 2011. But then, when we go to 2012, Libya, Benghazi, Chris Stevens, the staff there, they seem to fall off your radar in 2012, and the situation's getting much worse in 2012. It was getting much worse. And let me just share for you, in your records that we have reviewed, there is not one email to you or from you in 2012 when an explosive device went off at our compound in April. There's not a single email in your records about that explosive device. So my question is, this was a very important mission in 2011. You sent Chris Stevens there, but yet when our compound is attacked in 2012, what kind of culture was created in the State Department that your folks couldn't tell you in an email about a bomb in April of 2012?
Well, Congresswoman, I did not conduct most of the business that I did on behalf of our country on email. I conducted it in meetings. I read massive amounts of memos, a great deal of classified information. I made a lot of secure phone calls. I was in and out of the White House all the time. There were a lot of things that happened that I was aware of and that I was reacting to. If you were to be in my office in the State Department, I didn't have a computer. I did not do the vast majority of my work on email, and I bet there's a lot of Sid Blumenthal's emails in there from 2011 too.
Well, we'll get
and
to
so
that
I think
later.
that there were, I don't want you to have a mistaken impression about what I did and how I did it. Most of my work was not done on emails with my closest aides, with officials in the State Department, officials in the rest of the government, as well as the White House and people around the world.
And thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure that it's not all done on emails, Madam Secretary, and there are meetings and there are discussions. And so then when our compound took a second attack on June 6th, when a bomb blew a wall through the compound then, no emails at all. But I am interested in knowing, who were you meeting with, who were you huddling with, how were you informed about those things, because there is nothing in the emails that talks about 2 significant attacks on our compounds in 2012. There was a lot of information in 2011 about issues and security posture, and yet nothing in 2012.
Well, I'd be happy to explain. Every morning when I arrived at the State Department, usually between 8 and 8:30, I had a personal one-on-one briefing from the representative of the Central Intelligence Agency, who shared with me the highest level of classified information that I was to be aware of on a daily basis. I then had a meeting with the top officials of the State Department every day that I was in town. That's where a lot of information, including threats and attacks on our facilities, was shared. I also had a weekly meeting every Monday with all of the officials, the assistant secretaries and others, so that I could be brought up to date on any issue that they were concerned about. During the day, I received hundreds of pages of memos, many of them classified, some of them so top secret that they were brought into my office in a locked briefcase that I had to read and immediately return to the courier. And I was constantly at the White House in the Situation Room, meeting with the National Security Advisor and others. I would also be meeting with officials in the State Department, foreign officials, and others. So there was a lot going on during every day. I did not email during the day, and except on rare occasions when I was able to, but I didn't conduct the business that I did primarily on email. That is not how I gathered information, assessed information, asked the hard questions of the people that I worked with.
It appears that leaving Benghazi, with respect to all of that danger, leaving Benghazi was not an option in 2012, and I yield back.
Well, if I could just quickly respond, there was never a recommendation from any intelligence official in our government, from any official in the State Department, or from any other person with knowledge of our presence in Benghazi to shut down Benghazi, even after the 2 attacks that the compound suffered. And perhaps, you would wonder why, but I can tell you that it was thought that the mission in Benghazi, in conjunction with the CIA mission, was vital to our national interests.
Gentlelady from Indiana yields back. Chair will now briefly recognize Mr. Cummings and then Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify, when I was asking Secretary Clinton a question a moment ago, I mentioned an email that had gone from Ambassador Chris Stevens to Deputy Secretary Lamb. What I meant to say was a cable, and I just wanted to make sure the record was clear.
The record will reflect that. Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Clinton, I'm pleased that you finally have the opportunity to be here. Before I start my line of questioning, I just want to clarify with regards to the April-June 2012 incidents. I believe that the procedure that the State Department had for these types of incidents was to actually hold what are called emergency action committee hearings on the ground immediately. And in fact, there were at least 5 on the records for June alone on the ground in both Tripoli and Benghazi, and that is the correct procedure for handling such instances. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Secretary Clinton, my focus and my job on this committee is to make sure that we never put brave Americans like Ambassador Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty ever on the ground again anywhere in the world without the protection that they so rightly deserve. Having flown combat missions myself in some dangerous places, I understand the dedication of our men and women who choose to serve this country overseas. I have a special affinity for the diplomatic corps because These are folks who go in without the benefit of weapons, without the benefit of military might, armed only with America's values and diplomatic words and a handshake to forward our nation's interests globally. So I am absolutely determined to make sure that we safeguard, in the name of our heroic dead, our men and women in the diplomatic corps, wherever they are around the world. So the bottom line for me, I'm a very mission-driven person. The bottom line for me is, with respect to examining what went wrong in Benghazi, is clear. Let's learn from those mistakes, and let's figure out what we need to do to fix them. I've only been in Congress not quite 3 years, almost 3 years. And in this time, I've actually served on 2 other committees in addition to this one that has looked at the Benghazi attacks, both armed services and oversight and government reform. So I've had a chance to really look at all of these documents. One of the things that I saw, and I'd like you to discuss this with you, is that the Department of State and the Department of Defense at the time seems to have not had the most ideal cooperation when it came to threat or security analysis. I do know, however, that over the past decade, they've established a tradition of working together on the ground in dangerous regions that has increased over time. However, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, which also looked at the Benghazi attacks, I'm concerned that the interagency cooperation between state and DoD was not sufficient in the weeks and months leading up to the September 11, 2012 attacks. For example, the joint contingency planning and training exercises, if we had conducted any joint interagency planning and training exercises, this may have actually helped the state and DoD to identify and fix existing vulnerabilities in the temporary mission facility in Benghazi. Moreover, regular communications between AFRICOM, which is the DoD command, and the Special Mission Benghazi could have facilitated the pre-positioning of military assets in a region where there were very real questions over the host country's ability to protect our diplomatic personnel. Secretary Clinton, within the weeks of the terrorist attacks in Benghazi happening, following that, I understand you partnered with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to establish and deploy 5 interagency security assessment teams to assess our security posture and needs at least the 19 high threat posts in 13 different countries. In fact, Deputy Secretary Nides testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee in December of 2012 that the State Department and DoD ISAT initiative created a roadmap for addressing emerging security challenges. Why did you partner with the Department of Defense to conduct such a high priority review, and was it effective in addressing the shortfalls in Benghazi and applying it for other locations?
Congresswoman, thank you very much, and thanks for your service and particularly your knowledge about these issues arising from your own military service and the service on the committees here in the House. It's very challenging to get military assets into countries that don't want them there. And in fact, that has been a constant issue that we have worked between the State Department and the Department of Defense. The Libyans made it very clear from the very beginning they did not want any American military or any foreign military at all in their country. And what I concluded is that we needed to have these assessments because even if we couldn't post our own military in the country, we needed to have a faster reaction. Now, I certainly agree 100% with the findings of the Armed Services Committee here in the House and other investigations. Our military did everything they could. They turned over every rock. They tried to deploy as best they could to try to get to Benghazi. It was beyond the geographic range. They didn't have assets nearby because we don't have a lot of installations and military personnel that are in that immediate region. So following what happened in Benghazi, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, and I agreed to send out mixed teams of our diplomatic security and their top security experts from the Defense Department to get a better idea of the 19 high-threat posts, and that's exactly what we did. And it gave us some guidance to try to have better planning ahead of time. I know Admiral Mullen testified that it would be beyond the scope of our military to be able to provide immediate reaction to 270 posts, but that's why we tried to narrow down. And of course, we do get help from our military in war zones. The military has been incredibly supportive of our embassy in Kabul and our embassy in Baghdad. But we have a lot of hotspots now and very dangerous places that are not in military conflict areas where we have American military presence. So we wanted to figure out how we could get more quickly a fast reaction team